The year is 1821. Bay is moonless. Somewhere in the darkness, in the water's edge and the chalk cliffs, dozens of men are moving silent. They're passing casks of brandy, bales of silk. They're knee deep in the cold October, holding their breath. Their boots are quiet, and every one of them knows the penalty if they're caught. This is not a story from a novel. This is Birchington-on-Sea, Kent, England, and this is what the village was built on. I've said before, I've come down here all my life. It's always fascinated me. It's only now I'm taking the time to discover the history of it and share it with you. Welcome again to Peace Unplugged, podcast that provides local history connected to health and well-being. Birchington-on-Sea is the north of the Isle of Thanet in East Kent. It's a coastline that's meant something every civilization that has ever looked at England from across the water. The Romans passed through it, the Saxons settled it. Those stories are for another podcast in the future. For over 2 centuries, from the mid-1600s right through to the 1800s, smugglers owned it. To understand why this particular stretch of the coast became one of the most active smuggling corridors in all of Britain, you have to understand its geography and its poverty in the same breath. The cliff chalks are riddled with natural fissures, the bays are shallow and they are hidden. The marshland behind the shoreline offered concealment, and that stopped the armed revenue officers to a large extent catching those smugglers and the fishing communities that lived here. Families like the Hollands and the Darvies, they were earning less from full-time legal work than one night of successful smuggling. Smuggling in Georgian Kent was not the romanticised folk tale it has sometimes become. It was dangerous, it was organised, and it was brutal. But it was for many the only economy that made survival possible. Historians prefer the word free trading when describing the practice, as it was understood by those who carried it out. The world of smuggling carries moral weight, judgment passed from outside. For the communities of Thanet, what they were doing was far more pragmatic, circumventing the tax systems that they had no part in designing and no power to resist. By the 1720s, the British government had placed punishing excise duties on luxury imports, things like French brandy, Dutch gin, fine tobacco, silk and tea. For the wealthy classes, these taxes were just an inconvenience, but for Kent's coastal poor, they represented goods that were permanently out of reach. And for the men willing to take the risk and the run, they represented a living of sorts. The free traders of this coastline operated in sophisticated networks. Boats were modified for speed and low profile. Landing sites were pre-agreed through coded signals, a certain arrangement of lanterns along the cliff top, a specific sequence of flashes from a vessel offshore. Goods came across from France, from the Dutch coast, from vessels anchored just beyond the jurisdiction of British customs patrols. And once ashore, everything moved underground, quite literally. Perhaps nothing captures the imagination or the ingenuity of Birchington's smuggling heritage more powerfully than those tunnels. Here was probably likely one of the tunnels that, although it's bricked up now, on the cliff. But there are other areas where there were tunnels, where that contraband was smuggled. Hollands and Derby were among the dead, apparently buried in St Mary the Virgin Church, or churchyard, in Minster. This now is one of the most pleasant places to walk along by the coast. Peaceful and calming, excellent for both physical and mental health. So here we have the Church of St Mary the Virgin in Minster in Thanet, a beautiful building. Let's see if I can find these gravestones. The ancient ones are very worn, so I may not find what I'm looking for, but it's worth a look around. They're soft enough to cut, but hard enough to hold their shape, and they were worked by hand tools into wide passageways. A man could easily move a barrel through them with relative ease. And the historical record, combined with the oral accounts passed down through the generations, strongly suggests that the area beneath and around Birchington was threaded with an extensive network of those tunnels. They served a multiple purpose. They were storage, they were dry and temperature stable. That's ideal for handling casks of brandy and bales of cloth. Discovery was always a risk. They were transit corridors, allowing goods to move from the cliff edge or the beach and inland without appearing above ground, where revenue officers might spot them. And of course they were also escape routes. A man who knew his tunnel network would disappear underground and emerge half a mile away, far enough for those revenue officers searching for him not to find him. Several tunnels have been identified over the centuries. That's been through building work, through land surveys, and every now and then there's been a local subsidence in somebody's garden, or even perhaps on one of the roads. Those passages went through and beneath some of the oldest properties in and around Birchington. That's like pubs and farmhouses and cottages. It's reported that in the village of Sarr, just outside the border of Birchington, the King's Head pub has been associated with those tunnels, receiving and redistributing contraband goods. It's worth noting that some of these accounts have the quality of living memory rather than documented fact, passed down with warmth and sometimes a bit of embellishment. The physical evidence, where it's uncovered, is real enough. The tunnels exist, the routes were used, the village of Birchington knew about them, and they kept quiet. Two names in particular are linked to this history of Birchington smuggling. Those are the names Hollands and Darby.
Well, who knows? It could be these two. There's two together, but there's no markings on them at all.
These were not people just passing through. They were local families. They were part of the fabric of the community. They had roots in fishing and farming, and those were the trades that were the backbone of life in the Isle of Thanet. Their involvement in the free trade was not a departure from their community identity. It was their community identity, at least for a time. The Hollands family were well known across Thanet during the height of that smuggling era. They were known as the organisers, the men who managed the logistics. They coordinated between the boat crews and the shore parties. They knew which revenue officers to be avoided, and reportedly those that could be accommodated. In the language of the day, they were venturers. The Darby family occupied a slightly different role, albeit important. They were apparently the working runners, that is, the men that made the physical journey from shore to storage. They carried the risks on their back. Their name appears in the revenue records and the local historical accounts of that time, sometimes as suspects, sometimes as witnesses, and, as we are about to discover, sometimes as combatants. Members of both families are buried in the churchyard of St Mary the Virgin. That's in Minster in Thanet. It's one of the oldest and most beautiful Norman churches around the area. If you visit, take a moment to walk around the churchyard. Examine those worn inscriptions. They are, in a very real sense, the community at that time writing its own history.
It's a cool contraband from France, from Holland and Belgium. That would be silk, tea, brandy. And here was probably likely one of the tunnels that, although it's bricked up now, on the cliff. But there are other areas where there were tunnels, where that contraband was smuggled. Somewhere along this shoreline in October 1821, there was a firefight between smugglers, or free traders we might call them. It's between them and officers of the government, excise duty collectors. The names of Hollands and Derby were among the dead, apparently buried in St Mary the Virgin Church, or churchyard, in Minster. That contraband was part of the local economy. What was smuggled was beyond what most people around here could buy. But it became part of the economy until such time that tariffs were reduced to a more acceptable level, which actually then finished off that trade, that free trade, or smuggling. But the history lies here, along this coast, leading round from Beresford Gap to Minnis Bay. Despite the violence of that October night in 1821, this now is one of the most pleasant places to walk along by the coast. Peaceful and calming. Excellent for both physical and mental health. Somewhere along this shoreline in October 1821, there was a firefight between smugglers, or free traders we might call them. It's between them and officers of the government, excise duty collectors. Hollands and Derby were among the dead, apparently buried in St Mary the Virgin Church, or churchyard, in Minster, and was part of the local economy. Now we come to the event that sits at the very heart of this ancient Birchington story. That was the confrontation that occurred Minnis Bay in 1821. Minnis Bay, which older charts record as Marsh Bay, well, today it's a very family orientated and beloved beach. The promenade, cafes, the great view across to the Reculver Towers. It's a wonderful little unspoilt beach, very popular with visitors. But in October 1821, it was a killing ground. The confrontation that took place that night is one of the most dramatic and least celebrated episodes in the history of East Kent. A landing was in progress, goods coming in from offshore, coordinated by men who had made this run before, and they expected to do so again. What they did not expect on that dramatic night was the revenue officers. Coast Guard and excise patrols had been intensifying during this period. The government of the time had grown increasingly determined to break this free trade that was apparently costing the Treasury millions on an annual basis. So additional officers were deployed. The patrol routes were randomised. And of course there were the informers. That would be silk, tea, brandy. Here was probably likely one of the tunnels that, although it's bricked up now on the cliff, that there are other areas where there were tunnels, where that contraband was smuggled. That's a currency that always flows, and very much a free way in desperate communities. And these were being used more aggressively to anticipate the landings. On the night in question, officers arrived at Marsh Bay, known as Minnis Bay today, and the operation got underway. What followed was not a chase. It was a firefight. The smuggling party, which included members of the local free trading network with connections to the families of both Hollands and Derby, where they were armed, as they were routinely around this period. The revenue officers were also armed, so in the darkness of the bay on that cold October night, the firefight began. There were casualties on both sides. The exact casualty count is disputed, according to the surviving records. But what is established is that confrontation in Minnis Bay, 1821, was one of the most violent clashes between smugglers and revenue officers in the recorded history of Thanet. Some of those involved did not go home that night. The aftermath of this went right through the community. Arrests were made. Some men fled. The names that appear in the subsequent legal proceedings, including individuals traceable to the families that we've already discussed, and several gravestones at the Church of St Mary the Virgin apparently date to this period, carrying the weight of what those years cost. Standing at Minnis Bay today, it takes an act of historical imagination to feel the reality of that night. But it happened here, on this shore. The shootout at Minnis Bay in 1821 was not the end of smuggling in Birchington, but it was part of a longer turning point. Through the 1820s to the 1830s, the British government progressively reformed the Coast Guard service. It was restructured into a more professional service, better equipped and designed to break the organised free trade. And simultaneously, there were a number of reforms on the tariffs. The most significant of these was in the 1840s under Robert Peel's government. That removed many of the punishing import duties, which had made the smuggling at the time irresistible. When the profit margins disappear, the risk calculation changes. The men who had run brandy onto Marsh Bay found the sums no longer added up for them. I think it's a lesson that we can learn even today. By the mid-Victorian period, the age of smuggling on the Kent coast was effectively over. That's not because the people changed. It's because the economic conditions changed. The tunnels fell dark, signals went cold. The free traders became gradually just the fishermen again. At this point in the story, you might be wondering why there is the framing of a tale of smugglers and shootouts through the lens of health and well-being. And it's a fair question. And the answer, I think, is one of the most important things this podcast can offer you. Today, we're living in an era of profound disconnection, chronic stress, anxiety, a creeping sense of rootlessness. Mental health researchers point increasingly to the loss of community narrative as one of the reasons for this disconnection. We no longer know where we are from in the deepest sense. We no longer know the stories of the ground beneath our feet. Heritage, real, local lived heritage, well, that's the therapeutic resource that we dramatically undervalue. When you know that the road that you walk upon to the corner shop follows a path that was once used, men carrying brandy to a hiding place beneath a chalk farmhouse, something shifts. Present becomes layered. The ground becomes alive. You're not just a person in the place. You become a connection to that place. It's that sense of temporal belonging. It's being part of a much bigger story. Now that is psychological grounding. Research in ecotherapy and place-based well-being has consistently found that engagement with local history deepens our relationship with the natural environment. Walking down Minnis Bay with the knowledge of what happened is a very different experience to just walking along it with historical ignorance. You see, the wind feels different. The horizon means something. There's something very important about the complexity of history. The smugglers of Birchington were not heroes in that simple sense. Yeah, they broke the law. They carried weapons. People died. But they were also people that were navigating natural poverty in unjust economic times. This was the arithmetic of survival on an exposed coastline margin, holding that complexity, resisting the urge to flatten these people into either villains or folk heroes, is itself a form of emotional maturity. It teaches us to hold some nuances, to see humanity in difficult contexts, to understand that most people in the most difficult of circumstances are doing the best they can with what they have. That lesson is relevant today as it was in 1821. So let's bring together what we found. Birchington-on-Sea is not simply a large seaside village on the Isle of Thanet. It's a place where identity was forged in significant part by 2 centuries of free trading ran through its chalk geology. its fishing families. The tunnels beneath the older buildings are not legends, they are structural facts, and these have been confirmed by excavation. They stored brandy, they stored silk, they hid men. The Hollands family and the Darby family were not peripheral characters. In this story, they were central to it, embedded in the community fabric, their lives shaped by free trade, their deaths recorded in the churchyard of St Mary the Virgin in Minster, where their graves can still be visited today. The confrontation at Minnis Bay, Marsh Bay, in October 1821, was not a footnote. It was one of the most violent expressions of a 100-year conflict between free trading networks of Thanet and Kent and the government forces set to break them. It happened where children on the beach today are probably building their sandcastles. And that history matters, not because it's dramatic, though it is. It's because it's our history. Knowing it connects us. The ground beneath our feet is not empty. It's full of stories, and stories are what we're all made of. Next time you walk the promenade of Minnis Bay, I want you to try something. Stop, face the sea, close your eyes for a moment, notice the breeze on your face. Listen quietly. Fill your ears with something much older than you. Then look down at the sand and remember, in 1821, something happened that cost people their lives. Those people had names, Hollands and Darby, and there are other names that history has not recorded. In those chalk cliffs and tunnels, things were hidden. The village of Birchington stands behind you. The church, the lanes, the inns and the pubs, and the alehouses, the familiar contours of a place that feels settled and safe, and it was shaped in both visible and invisible ways. What was smuggled was beyond what most people around here could buy, but it became part of the economy until such time that tariffs were reduced to a more acceptable level, which actually then finished off that trade, that free trade or smuggling. But the history lies here along this coast, leading round from Beresford Gap to Minnis Bay. I've said before, I've come down here all my life. It's always fascinated me. It's only now I'm taking the time to discover the history of it and share it with you. History is not the past. History is the ground you're standing on. Thank you again for listening to Peace Unplugged. I hope you enjoyed this episode. Stay safe and stay at peace. Bye for now. Despite the violence of that October 21, this now is one of the most pleasant places to walk along by the coast. Peaceful and calming. Excellent for both physical and mental health.